A teenage Muslim girl was put on trial for wearing her hijab to school, but the real twist, the judge presiding over her case, was her estranged father. He didn't know. She didn't know. But as her voice echoed through the courtroom, something shattered inside him. Not just the law, but the lie he had lived for 15 years. What happens when justice collides with blood? When a daughter defends her faith, and a father is forced to face the truth he left behind? This wasn't just a legal battle. It became a reunion written by fate and guided by faith. If you're ready to witness a verdict that broke the courtroom and healed a family, press 1 to begin. The grand courtroom buzzed with tension long before the proceedings began. Journalists filled the back rows, cameras angled just below the judge's bench. Lawyers shuffled through folders, reporters whispered predictions, and somewhere amid the murmurs, a storm was quietly gathering. Presiding over it all sat Judge Henri Valois, a name that commanded respect and in some circles fear. With decades of experience and a reputation for ruthlessly upholding the secular code of the Republic, Valois had never once faltered in his defense of neutrality. To him, the law was sacred, more sacred than any scripture. Today's case, he told himself, was no different. A teenage girl expelled from school for wearing a hijab, a legal challenge backed by civil rights groups, a media frenzy over what many now called the Battle of the Scarf. Valois flipped through the case file without emotion. The name Lina Rahmani meant nothing to him at first glance. Just another plaintiff, another symbol of defiance, another courtroom performance wrapped in religious appeal. He looked up as the doors opened, and there she was. A 17-year-old girl in a white hijab standing beside a composed woman in a long coat, her mother most likely. Lina walked with calm steps toward the front bench, not defiant, not nervous, just still. Her scarf was neatly folded, pinned beneath her chin, her posture upright. In her hands, she held nothing but a small leather bag. For a flicker of a second, Valois felt something tighten in his chest. Her eyes. There was something familiar, an echo from a past he had long sealed off. He pushed the feeling aside. He glanced toward the prosecutor, Marcel Durand, confident, calculated, and eager for the spotlight. Marcel stood and launched into his opening remarks. This case is not about a girl. It is about our republic, our values, our secular foundations. To compromise them is to compromise who we are. Applause scattered from the gallery. Valois nodded coolly as expected. He turned the page in the file again. Rahmani? Something in the name scratched at a memory, but he didn't look up. Not yet. Because what he didn't know, what no one in the room yet knew, was that the girl now seated before him wasn't just another case. She was his daughter. And truth was about to put more than the law on trial. The courtroom fell into a practiced rhythm as the bailiff called for order. Prosecutor Marcel Durand shuffled confidently to his place at the center, speaking with theatrical clarity about the sanctity of secularism and the threat of visible religious extremism in academic institutions. His words floated through the chamber like smoke, sharp, rehearsed, hollow. Lina Rahmani sat still, unmoved. The white of her hijab gleamed under the courtroom lights, but it was her composure that made people look twice. She didn't fidget. She didn't shrink. Her hands rested in her lap, Quran tucked quietly in her bag. She wasn't fighting with fire. She had come armed with silence, with clarity, with truth. Judge Henri Valois watched her carefully. The prosecutor's arguments spilled forward, but Valois' eyes returned again and again to the girl seated before him. Something gnawed at the edge of his mind. Her name, her stillness, her features. There was something he couldn't quite place and didn't want to. The gallery was packed. Activists sat beside lawmakers. Feminist icons clashed with faith leaders across the aisle. Cameras hovered like vultures waiting to catch any flicker of drama. Headlines were already forming. Hijab trial nation on edge. When the prosecution finished, Valois cleared his throat. Miss Rahmani, he said, his tone precise and neutral. You may now speak on your own behalf. Lina stood slowly. For a moment, the room was hushed. No one expected much. She was, after all, just a teenager, a girl with a scarf and a cause. But when Lina began to speak, her voice didn't waver. I didn't come here to challenge a nation, she said gently. I came here to defend a choice. There was no tremble, no performance, just the kind of stillness that makes people listen. I am 17. I go to school. I study hard. I laugh with friends. I want to be a writer." She paused, scanning the room. "But one morning I was told I could no longer enter my school unless I removed this." Her hand gently touched her hijab. "I was told this cloth made me incompatible with education." Judge Valois leaned forward slightly. Lena continued, "I did not put this on because anyone forced me. I chose it because I wanted to decide how the world saw me, because I wanted to carry my faith proudly without hiding." Murmurs rippled across the benches. Marcel Duran smirked, ready to interject. And what if that choice he cut in encourages others to adopt submission over freedom? Lena turned her gaze to him. "Submission to God is not submission to oppression. Choosing faith doesn't erase thought. It protects it. It purifies it." Judge Valois felt his throat dry. Her voice had stirred something. Not just emotion, recognition. He stared at her face again, her jawline, her brows, the way her eyes held courage without arrogance. A memory rose like smoke, a woman once standing at the door of their apartment, cradling a baby wrapped in white. He clenched his fist under the bench. No, it couldn't be. But the crack had started. Lena's voice lowered slightly. "This trial is about clothing, but it's really about fear. The fear of what my scarf represents, belief, modesty, conviction. But fear is not a reason to erase someone." She turned then, not to the judge, not to the prosecutor, but to the crowd. "I am French. I know your laws. I respect your flag. But if I must strip a part of myself to belong, then you are not asking for unity. You are asking for silence." Judge Valois swallowed hard. Her words stabbed deeper than he could admit. He had heard thousands testify, but never like this, because deep inside, in a place he thought long buried, he was beginning to remember her name. The next morning, the courtroom was fuller than before. Word had spread of the girl in the white hijab who spoke like a scholar and stood like a stone in a storm. Outside, news vans lined the curb. Commentators clashed on morning panels, dissecting her every word. Some called her bold, others manipulative. But all agreed Lina Rahmani had become more than a symbol. She had become a question the country could no longer avoid. Inside the courtroom, prosecutor Marcel Duran adjusted his tie, his jaw a little tighter than usual. He stepped forward with renewed aggression, wielding legal citations and philosophical rhetoric. "This is not about a scarf," he thundered. "It is about precedent. If we let symbols of religious identity creep into our secular schools, where does it stop?" He turned to Lena as if daring her. "Miss Rahmani may believe she is acting freely, but what child truly chooses such burden at 12? Is it not likely, perhaps even obvious, that this is the product of pressure from family, from the community, from her mother?" There it was, the subtle dagger. Lena's mother, Amal Rahmani, sat in the front row, her expression unreadable. Judge Valois glanced at her briefly and felt a chill crawl down his spine. That face, the same calm defiance. His stomach turned. Lena rose calmly. "No one forced me," she said. "I was 12 when I asked. My mother told me to wait, to think. I did. And when I wore it, it wasn't for men or culture or control. It was because for the first time I understood that dignity can be quiet." Duran laughed dryly. "Is dignity quiet when it undermines national cohesion?" Lena turned to the judge this time. Her gaze held. "Is cohesion built by denying me the right to be whole?" That sentence landed hard, especially on the man behind the bench. Judge Valois tried to remain composed, but his fingers tapped against the base of his chair. He looked at Lena, really looked, and the memories came back clearer than before. Amal Rahmani, the woman he once loved but left when she refused to renounce her faith. He remembered the argument, the slammed door, the child's soft cry. He had told her, "If you choose religion, you do it without me." He never saw the baby again, until now. And suddenly the courtroom felt suffocating. He recessed for 10 minutes, officially citing procedure. In truth, he needed air, space. He found a hallway and leaned against the marble wall, gripping the edge of his robe. Could it be, could this girl, the one the nation was debating, the one he was judging, be his daughter? Back in the courtroom, Lena waited unaware. Her heart beat fast, but not from fear. Something about today felt different, heavier, as if the trial was bigger than law, as if something unseen hovered just beyond her understanding. When Judge Valois returned, his composure was forced. His voice shook ever so slightly. "Miss Rahmani, you may continue your response." She nodded, standing once more. "If the law demands that I remove this scarf to receive an education, then the law is not protecting me, it is reshaping me." She breathed deeply. "And if a father were listening, not just as a judge, but as a man, I would ask him, would you rather see your daughter silent in shame or speaking with sincerity?" Judge Valois froze. That was no legal argument, that was a message. And the walls he had built brick by brick over years of distance and denial had begun to crack. He wasn't just hearing her now, he was seeing her. The court reconvened after lunch, the air tense and heavy like a storm about to break. No one could quite name the reason. The trial had proceeded as expected, but there was something beneath the surface, something not on the record, but beating louder than any gavel. Amal Rahmani was called to the stand. As she stepped up, the room shifted. Her steps were quiet, composed, but purposeful. Her black hijab contrasted softly with her deep green overcoat. She didn't look like a woman on trial. She looked like a mother who had already endured more than the courtroom could imagine. Judge Valois stared at her. Time folded. 15 years ago, they had stood on opposite ends of a hospital room. He had wanted a daughter baptized, raised modern neutral. Amal had held her baby tighter and said she will choose her path when she's ready. But I will not let her grow up ashamed of where she comes from. And then he had walked out, slammed the door on both of them. Now that woman stood before him, not in anger, not in fear, but in silent strength. Mrs. Rahmani, the prosecutor, began, his tone smooth and rehearsed. "You've been raising your daughter alone, yes?" "Yes," she answered calmly. "Would you say your faith had an influence on her decision to wear the hijab?" Amal looked at him directly. "My presence influenced her. My example. Not my pressure, but you encouraged her. I lived what I believe. She watched me. She chose what felt right for her." Duran pushed. "Would she still be wearing the hijab if you weren't in the picture?" Amal's voice sharpened slightly. "Would any child make choices without the people who raised them?" A few heads in the audience nodded. Duran shifted uncomfortably. Judge Valois sat motionless, but inside his heart pounded. Her voice was the same, unshaken, dignified. She hadn't changed, and neither had the ache in his chest. Duran moved on. "Do you regret encouraging her to be confrontational with state policy?" Amal's eyes narrowed. "I regret nothing that taught my daughter to carry herself with dignity." She stepped down a few moments later, returning to her seat beside Lena. As she sat, Lena gently reached over and touched her mother's hand. It was the kind of gesture a daughter gives when words aren't enough, and Judge Valois felt it deeply. He glanced at Lena, his daughter. There was no doubt now, no room left for denial. His hands trembled beneath his desk, his thoughts unraveled in loops. He had spent years defending reason law neutrality, and yet here before him stood the living product of a decision he thought he had made in strength, but now saw had been born of pride and fear. Lena stood again, this time with a paper in her hand. "Your Honor," she said, requesting permission to read a prepared statement. He nodded, unable to speak. She began. "I never knew my father. Not really. I only know he left when I was a baby. I grew up wondering if he'd be proud of who I became, if he'd think I was good, if he'd listen to me if he saw me speak one day. Every word was a knife that he silently absorbed. I'm not angry. I don't hate him. But I wish I could tell him this scarf I wear, this faith I carry, it's not a wall between us. It's a bridge I would have crossed to find him if he had stayed." The courtroom sat breathless. Lena folded the paper and looked up. "I hope wherever he is, he knows I don't blame him. I just hope he would still see me as his daughter." Judge Valois felt the room disappear. He wasn't seated on a bench anymore. He was seated in front of a mirror. And everything he had tried to forget now stood speaking back to him with a voice soft as silk and strong as truth. That evening, long after the courtroom had emptied and the media had descended into their nightly frenzy, Judge Henri Valois sat alone in his chambers, the lights dimmed to a soft amber glow. The city outside buzzed on, but inside the paneled walls of justice time had slowed. He wasn't reviewing legal briefs or case law. Instead, he opened a small drawer in his desk, the one he never touched. From the back beneath a file he hadn't looked at in years, he pulled out a yellowed envelope unopened. It had his name on it, the handwriting neat, familiar, Amal Rahmani. He stared at it for a long time before slowly breaking the seal. His fingers trembled not with age but with everything he had buried. Inside was a letter, written long ago, written in the months after he left her. Henri, if you're reading this, then perhaps something in you still wonders. I didn't write to accuse you. I wrote to tell you that your daughter has your eyes, that she laughs at birds and sleeps with her hand curled under her cheek like you did when you were young. You said I chose religion over reason. But what if faith is not the opposite of reason? What if it's what completes it? One day she will ask about you. I will tell her that you were brilliant, that you loved justice. I hope by then you will remember that justice must start at home. His throat tightened. A lifetime of walls, arguments, and convictions began to crack under the weight of a single paragraph. He stared at the photograph she had included. A small girl in a summer dress, missing her front teeth, smiling up at the camera with her whole face. It was unmistakably Lena, unmistakably his daughter. For a man known to deliver verdicts with cold clarity, this moment rendered him fragile, hollow, human. He leaned back in his chair, hands covering his face. She had never stopped trying to reach him. And today on that witness stand, she had done it without even knowing. Not with blame, but with forgiveness. The next morning, he walked through the courthouse early, long before anyone arrived. He stopped by the courtroom and stood in the doorway, staring at the bench where he had sat for decades. It had always been a place of control, of logic, of separation, but now it felt like a place of reckoning. Later that day, the trial resumed. The final arguments were due. Marcel Durand came armed with law codes and public opinion polls. He was ready to finish what he started, make an example of Lena, make her scarf into a cautionary tale. But the judge was no longer the same man. He watched the proceedings in silence. When it came time for Lena's closing remarks, she stood once more not to argue, but to speak with a calm that had become her signature. This isn't about religion versus country, she said. It's about whether I'm allowed to exist in both. She paused. I didn't come here to prove I'm French. I came to prove I'm not a threat. Then she looked directly at the bench. And I hope the person who hears this sees me not as a case file, not as a cause, but as a person, a citizen, a daughter. That word lingered. Daughter. And in that moment, Judge Henri Valois knew he had not been called to judge her. He had been called to remember her. The courtroom was silent when Judge Henri Valois returned from his chambers. No rustling papers, no whispered gossip, only the stillness of a space bracing for impact. Every camera was fixed on the bench. Every breath felt held. The entire nation, it seemed, had paused for this moment. Judge Valois sat tall, his robe crisp, but something was different. The steel in his posture remained, yet there was a softness around the eyes. A storm passed. A wall lowered. In his hand was the ruling. In his heart, a conflict no gavel could settle. He scanned the room. His gaze landed on Lena, sitting beside her mother, hands folded neatly in her lap. White hijab wrapped as it had been from the start. She looked up at him with no plea, no performance, just quiet dignity. He cleared his throat. This court, he began, was not summoned to interpret religion, but to uphold the law of this republic. Marcel Durand leaned forward, expectant, his smirk barely contained. But Valois continued, when the law is used not to protect liberty, but to punish identity, then this court must pause and reconsider what justice actually looks like. A ripple ran through the courtroom. Some frowned. Others blinked in disbelief. The right to religious expression, he said, voice firm, now cannot be stripped by institutional policy, especially when that expression does not disrupt public order, but only challenges perception. Durand's smirk faltered. Judge Valois took a breath longer this time. In the matter of Lena Romani versus the National Board of Education, this court finds that the plaintiff's expulsion was unconstitutional and in violation of her right to freely practice and express her religion. The expulsion is hereby overturned. Gasps. Audible, unfiltered gasps. The gallery erupted, not with applause, but with stunned realization. People looked at one another as if confirming what they had heard. Lena froze. Her hand tightened on her mother's. Amal looked toward the judge with eyes that glistened not with victory, but with quiet vindication. Judge Valois wasn't finished. He leaned forward slightly, eyes trained on Lena. This court also wishes to commend the plaintiff for her composure, her clarity, and her courage throughout these proceedings. His voice softened almost imperceptibly. She has reminded us that law must serve people, not erase them. Lena nodded once. Her lips didn't move, but her eyes said everything. Duran looked down at his notes, now useless. His arguments lay deflated like tired slogans in a world that had already moved past them. Outside the courtroom, the crowd was already gathering. News alerts buzzed on phones. Social media exploded. Hijab trial ends in shocking turn. Secular court upholds religious right. Judge sides with Muslim teen. But inside, Lena remained in her seat, grounded. She had not come for applause. The trial was over. But something else lingered. As the room began to empty, Judge Valois stood slowly. His robe weighed more than usual. The court officers moved to escort him out, but he raised a hand just slightly and stepped down from the bench. The gallery thinned. Reporters rushed past him, but he moved toward only one person. Lena and Amal had just risen, preparing to leave. He reached them. Amal turned first. Her breath caught lips parting in stunned recognition. She hadn't expected him to approach. Not after all these years, not like this. But he looked only at Lena. He removed his glasses slowly, as if shedding the last layer of distance. "I owe you more than a verdict," he said, voice low. Lena stared confused. "I owe you a lifetime, one I walked away from." The silence between them stretched wide, then gently collapsed. Amal stepped back slightly, allowing the space only a father and daughter could fill. "You're..." Lena's voice cracked. "You're him," he nodded. And for the first time, Judge Henri Valois didn't feel like a judge. He felt like a father, asking to be forgiven. Outside the courthouse, the nation's cameras surged, microphones angled in all directions. But Lena didn't stop for interviews. She held tightly to her mother's hand and walked straight through the crowd, head high, heart quiet. The reporters called her name, shouted for comments, pushed for headlines, but she was no longer a headline. She had become something far deeper. Behind her, the man who had once ruled courtrooms with absolute certainty now stood on the courthouse steps alone, in thought surrounded by noise. Judge Henri Valois, father in hiding, now revealed, watched as his daughter disappeared into a world he had never entered, a world he had once judged from the outside. Now it called to him not with judgment, but with mercy. Later that evening, a quiet knock came at the apartment door. Amal answered it and met his eyes for the first time without a courtroom between them. They didn't speak for a moment. They didn't need to. "I should have come sooner," he said softly. Amal nodded, her gaze steady. "You were not ready." "She looks like you," he whispered. "She carries you," she replied. "Your silence, your strength. But her heart, she built that on her own." He hesitated. Would she want to see me again? "She's waiting in the other room." His breath caught. Inside, Lena sat cross-legged on the rug in the living room, thumbing through her Quran. When she looked up and saw him, she didn't stand immediately. She just studied him, the lines in his face, the stiffness in his posture, the weight of guilt that no robe could hide. "I didn't recognize you at first," she said quietly. "I didn't recognize myself," he admitted. Silence stretched between them again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was gentle, like a door being opened after years of being locked. "I didn't come to ask for your forgiveness," he said. "I came to earn your presence." Lena nodded slowly. "You don't have to say anything more. You listened. That was the first step." Tears welled in his eyes. "Do you hate me?" She looked at him, really looked at him. Then with the same poise she carried in court, she shook her head. "No, I prayed for you." That broke him. He sat down, not beside her, but across from her, like a student to a teacher. And for the first time in his life, Henri Valois, the man of law, the man of reason, asked a question he had never dared ask before. "Will you teach me about what I missed?" And Lena, without smiling, without showing triumph, simply nodded. "We can start together." The night passed slowly. No cameras, no statements. Just pages of the Quran, read aloud, questions answered in whispers, memories exchanged in silence. By morning, something had changed, not in politics, not in law, but in the human heart. Across the city, the verdict was still being debated. Pundits argued, columnists raged, activists celebrated. But in a modest apartment, a daughter sat with the father she never knew, now reborn by the very truth he once tried to suppress. And in that quiet space, faith was no longer on trial. It had already won, not by force, but by forgiveness, not through victory, but through return. He was a world-class historian with one mission: to dismantle the legacy of Prophet Muhammad. Armed with credentials, evidence, and academic arrogance, he set out to write the ultimate takedown of Islam's final messenger. But what happened next? No one expected. The more he studied, the fewer contradictions he found. The more he searched for myths, the more he uncovered mercy, justice, and undeniable truth. What would make a man abandon decades of doubt in a single whisper? And why did he say, "I didn't lose my objectivity, I lost my arrogance"? If you're ready to witness a mind shattered by truth and a soul reborn in submission, press 1 to begin. The lecture hall buzzed with intellectual anticipation. Professors, graduate students, and curious observers filled the rows, pens and recorders ready. At the front stood Dr. Jonathan Reed, a man whose voice carried the weight of academic confidence. Known for dismantling religious traditions with surgical precision, he had made a career out of historical skepticism. Tonight's topic lit up the room: the historical Muhammad mythman or messenger. Jonathan adjusted his blazer, scanned the audience, and began with his usual cool defiance. "I've spent my career separating truth from tradition, and if the Prophet Muhammad existed, then surely we can dissect his life with the same tools we've used on Moses, Jesus, and Buddha." Laughter rippled gently through the crowd. "This isn't about faith," he continued. "It's about facts. And I intend to publish the most critical biography ever written of Islam's founder. A man hailed as a prophet, yet shrouded in legend." The applause was confident. The university press was already buzzing. But in the back corner, a quiet Muslim student listened silently, hands folded. No protest, no anger, just calmness and a silent dua, "Ya Allah, let truth defend itself." Dr. Reed stepped down from the podium, unaware that the path he had just announced with certainty would be the one that unraveled his pride and rebuilt his soul. Dr. Jonathan Reed dove into his research with the hunger of a man ready to prove a thesis he had already believed. His office, once neatly organized, soon overflowed with manuscripts, books, photocopies, and timeline charts. Early Islamic sources, Orientalist commentaries, Hadith collections, and Quranic translations all stacked like evidence, waiting for a verdict. He started with the Quran itself, not out of reverence but necessity. "If I'm going to deconstruct the Prophet," he muttered, "I have to begin with his book." Expecting legend and mythology, he found neither. There were no long genealogies or divine battles, no pagan drama. Instead, the Quran spoke with unexpected directness. It was not written in the voice of Muhammad, but in the voice of God speaking to him, commanding, correcting, consoling. Sometimes gentle, sometimes firm, but always precise. He frowned. "This doesn't read like a man's invention. It's structured more like dialogue." Still, he pressed on. One afternoon, while comparing different Quran translations, he noticed a student lingering just outside his office, a thin young man in simple clothes. Dr. Reed barely looked up. "Yes," the student hesitated. "I'm sorry to interrupt. I saw your name on the guest lecture list. I'm Muslim, and I thought if you're researching our prophet, maybe you'd want a copy of the Quran in Arabic too. Even if just for reference." Jonathan blinked. "I can't read Arabic." The student smiled gently. "Still, it's the source, and sometimes the tone matters as much as the words." He handed over a small leather-bound Quran. Inside was a note: "Not to convince, just to understand." Jonathan nodded tersely, then returned to his work. That night, as he cross-referenced verses between translations, he landed on one that stopped him mid-sentence. "Do they not reflect upon the Quran? If it had been from other than Allah, they would have found in it much contradiction." Quran 4:82. He read it again and again. It wasn't a threat, it was a challenge, one only a supremely confident writer would make. He scribbled in the margins, "Unusual tone, not defensive, invites scrutiny." The next day, he met the Muslim student on campus by chance. The young man offered a warm salam. Jonathan, curious despite himself, asked, "Did Muhammad claim to write any of it?" The student shook his head. He couldn't read or write. The Quran wasn't his authorship, it was his burden. That word burden stuck in Jonathan's chest long after they parted. Over the next week, he read more. The verses didn't plead for belief. They commanded thought. They addressed doubt. They exposed hypocrisy. It wasn't what he expected from a so-called fabricated scripture. The more he resisted, the more a small voice inside whispered, "What if it's not myth? What if it's memory?" He told himself it was too early for conclusions. He still had to examine the prophet's life, his wars, his marriages, his companions, the development of Islamic law. But something had changed. The voice he had ignored, the young student with the Quran, had pierced the armor of academia with something no journal could cite: sincerity. And in the quiet moments between reading and resisting, Dr. Jonathan Reed was beginning to feel something he hadn't felt in years. Not faith, not fear, but curiosity. Real, unsettling, necessary curiosity. The deeper Dr. Jonathan Reed ventured into the historical record, the more frustrated he became. He had expected contradictions, embellishments, and inconsistencies, the usual symptoms of religious mythology. Instead, he found something unsettlingly coherent. He read the Surah, the biography of Prophet Muhammad, through the lens of a skeptic. He noted dates, traced lineage, compared tribal dynamics. And yet, the more he investigated, the harder it became to dismiss. The prophet's life was astonishingly detailed, preserved across generations, with a rigor absent in most pre-modern history. Still, Jonathan clung to the assumption that with enough pressure, the cracks would show. He focused on early battles. Surely here, he muttered, "I'll find opportunism, power grabs," but the evidence betrayed no such narrative. The prophet avoided conflict where possible, forgave enemies, forbade looting, and even prohibited harming non-combatants and crops. This wasn't the warlord Jonathan had hoped to expose. It was a man burdened by revelation, pleading for peace, yet ready to defend truth when attacked. He dug into the prophet's personal life, searching for scandal. Polygamy too easy, yet every marriage had social, tribal, or protective logic. No luxury, no indulgence. Most of his life was marked by poverty and service, not privilege. Jonathan paced in his office one evening, books scattered like fallen walls. He opened the Quran again. "Muhammad is not the father of any one of your men, but he is the messenger of Allah and the seal of the prophets." Quran 33:40. He jotted in the margins, "Why call himself a messenger if it risked rejection, persecution, and exile?" His colleagues began to notice his shift. He no longer scoffed at religious topics during faculty meetings. When asked how the deconstruction of Muhammad was going, he only offered tight-lipped responses, still digging. But inside, he was grappling with something more than academic resistance. It was pride. How could he admit, after decades of study, that perhaps he had been wrong about the very nature of truth? Late one night, he opened a blank Word document titled "Contradictions in Muhammad's Legacy." He stared at the screen. Nothing came. Instead, he opened a folder of quotes from the prophet. One said, "The best among you are those who have the best character." Another, "None of you truly believes until he loves for his brother what he loves for himself." These weren't war cries or divine delusions. They were principles, ethical, universal, alive. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. "Why would a false prophet establish a legacy of justice, mercy, and self-sacrifice?" he whispered. He flipped through his notes and paused at a scribbled question he'd once written dismissively. What kind of man transforms an entire civilization without armies or wealth? Now that question didn't feel rhetorical. It felt frighteningly real. In the stillness of that moment, Jonathan realized that this wasn't about evidence anymore. It was about ego. He had come to the battlefield armed with intellect and doubt, expecting to win by default. But instead of finding a fraud, he found a man of truth whose shadow stretched across centuries. And now, for the first time, Dr. Jonathan Reed didn't know whether to keep writing or start listening. Dr. Jonathan Reed boarded a flight to the Arabian Peninsula under the guise of field research. He told his colleagues he wanted to immerse himself in the cultural context, but the truth was simpler and far more personal. He wanted to see the land where it all began. The sands, the ruins, the mosques, the voices of those still echoing the name of a man he could no longer ignore. He visited old libraries in Medina, walked barefoot through the narrow alleys of Mecca's outskirts, and sat for hours in quiet museums, gazing at maps of trade routes once traveled by a man who couldn't read or write, yet who moved civilizations. But it wasn't the scrolls or stones that moved him. It was the people. The man who offered him water at a desert rest stop without asking anything in return. The child who recited Quran from memory with eyes full of light. The shopkeeper who, upon hearing Jonathan was a guest, refused payment and simply said, "The Prophet taught us to serve the traveler." They weren't preaching, they were living. And something inside Jonathan, long buried under years of academic armor, began to stir. One evening he sat alone in a small guest house on the edge of the Hijaz. The call to prayer echoed faintly across the hills. He opened a worn copy of the Sirah and reread a passage he had glossed over a dozen times before the moment when Quraysh offered Prophet Muhammad kingship. Women and wealth, if only he would stop preaching. The Prophet's reply, memorized by millions but never felt by Jonathan until now, pierced straight through him. "By Allah, if they placed the sun in my right hand and the moon in my left, I would not abandon this message." Jonathan stared at the page. His throat tightened. "Who refuses power for truth?" he whispered aloud. "Who walks away from everything?" For God, he closed the book, suddenly overwhelmed. There was no financial gain, no bloodline dynasty, no empire built for ego. Just resistance, exile, hunger loss, and unwavering mission. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, hands gripping his forehead. The silence in the room wasn't oppressive. It was surgical, removing the last fragments of doubt from a heart that had learned to distrust everything. Tears welled in his eyes. He had spent years dissecting stories, decoding myths, and exposing falsehoods. But this wasn't myth. It was too raw, too real, too pure. He wept not from defeat, but from recognition. "I don't think you were lying," he said quietly into the room. "I think I was." That night he couldn't sleep. He didn't want to. He sat near the window looking at the stars above the desert, the same sky the Prophet once gazed at. For the first time, he didn't want to ask a question. He wanted to make a prayer, but he didn't know how. So with trembling hands and a cracked voice, he whispered the only thing his heart could form. "God, if this is truth, I won't fight it anymore." And in that moment, a historian stopped chasing footnotes and started chasing something far greater. When Dr. Jonathan Reed returned to campus, the air felt different, not because the university had changed, but because he had. The walls of his office no longer inspired pride, only perspective. The degrees, awards, and leather-bound books on his shelf, once trophies of intellectual conquest, now seemed like relics from a past life that no longer spoke for him. He delayed his manuscript submission. His colleagues grew impatient. "Jonathan, the world is waiting for your thesis on Muhammad," one of them reminded him over coffee. "You promised to expose the roots of a global illusion." But Jonathan had stopped seeing illusion. He had started seeing integrity. He reread his own notes. Instead of refutations, they now read like reluctant affirmations. No political ambition evident. Early followers had nothing to gain, only persecution. Moral consistency unmatched. In his quiet moments, he found himself returning to a single verse in the Quran, one he couldn't shake. "And we have not sent you, O Muhammad, except as a mercy to the worlds." Quran 21, 107. That word mercy was not the tool of a conqueror, it was the signature of sincerity. He thought of the Prophet forgiving the people of Mecca after years of torture. He thought of him standing for justice even when it was against his own tribe. He thought of the tears he shed in prayer, the children who clung to him, the way his enemies became his most loyal companions. What man invents a message that challenges his own comfort, threatens his life, and demands he carry it for 23 years without faltering? The final crack came when he revisited the Prophet's farewell sermon. There in a few lines was a blueprint for universal human rights delivered centuries before such language existed. No racism, no class superiority, sacredness of life justice between men and women. It was too clear, too powerful, too real to be an accident. Jonathan could no longer pretend he was assembling a critique. He was witnessing a revelation. One night, unable to sleep, he called the Muslim student he had once dismissed. "Can we meet?" he asked. They met in a quiet park near the university. The student brought a simple prayer rug. No pressure, no preaching, just presence. "I didn't expect this," Jonathan confessed. "I came to disprove a man I didn't believe existed." "And what did you find?" the student asked gently. Jonathan looked down, eyes moist. "I found someone too true to ignore." He paused. "I'm not ready to say everything out loud, but I believe it now. All of it." The student smiled. "Then say what your heart already knows." But Jonathan shook his head. "Not yet. I've lived so long for reputation. If I do this, I want to do it for truth, not reaction." "Then keep walking," the student said. "Faith doesn't demand performance, only sincerity." And so Dr. Jonathan Reed walked quietly back to his office, not to complete a book of critique, but to start one of confession. He opened a blank page and wrote, "I set out to dismantle a prophet, but I found a man who dismantled me." His hands trembled, not from doubt, but from the weight of finally letting go. It wasn't defeat, it was liberation. And for the first time in his academic life, Jonathan realized, the more you surrender to truth, the more it lifts you. The invitation to speak at the Global Religious History Symposium arrived in a polished envelope embossed with gold trim and academic pride. Dr. Jonathan Reed was listed as the keynote speaker, introduced as the historian, bringing a critical lens to the life of Muhammad. The room would be packed with professors, skeptics, journalists, and admirers of his previous work. They expected controversy, revelation-shaking conclusions, a sharp dismantling of faith. But Jonathan wasn't the same man who had accepted that invitation months ago. On the day of the lecture, he stood backstage in silence, not pacing, just breathing. In his hands was a manuscript, but not the one they expected. The original draft had been abandoned. In its place were handwritten notes titled, "What I Couldn't Refute." He stepped onto the stage, the applause erupting with academic enthusiasm. Microphones buzzed, lights dimmed, expectations soared. He looked out across the sea of eyes, some curious, some calculating, some waiting to pounce. He took a deep breath. "I want to begin tonight," he said, "not as a scholar, but as a man who was certain of something that turned out to be wrong." A hush fell instantly. "I came to this research project with an objective to critically examine the life of Muhammad and expose inconsistencies, myths, and human invention. I believed religion was always at its core, a man-made solution to existential anxiety." He paused, glancing down at his paper, then back at the crowd. "But the more I read, the more I studied, the more I dug through centuries of text archaeology, oral tradition, and comparative theology, the more I realized something terrifying." Another pause. The room leaned forward. He was telling the truth. A wave of confusion rippled through the crowd. One professor coughed awkwardly. Another whispered to a colleague. Jonathan continued, voice steady. "Not only was there a profound absence of contradiction in the Quran and prophetic tradition, but the life of Muhammad stood in absolute contrast to every profile of false prophecy I had ever studied. No self-gain, no manipulation, just clarity, pain, sacrifice, and mercy." He let the words hang. "Tonight, I won't be presenting a historical deconstruction. I won't be offering an academic takedown. What I offer instead is an apology to truth, to sincerity, and to the man I was too proud to see clearly." Gasps, silence, stunned disbelief. A voice from the back broke the stillness. "Are you saying you believe now?" Jonathan hesitated, then nodded. "I'm saying I believe he was who he said he was. I haven't made the formal step, not yet, but I no longer doubt it, and that alone has changed everything." Reporters scrambled. Tweets erupted. Some in the room applauded slowly. Others stared in horror. A few stood up and left in protest. But Jonathan remained still, peaceful. "I no longer care about the career fallout," he said softly, "because what I've gained is far more valuable than position or prestige. I've gained direction." After the lecture, the Muslim student he had once dismissed stood at the edge of the crowd. Jonathan walked up to him quietly. "I said what I needed to say," he whispered. "And you said it with truth," the student replied. Jonathan smiled. "Next time, I think I want to learn how to say it in Arabic." That night, under the same stars that had once guided desert caravans, a historian known for exposing myths made a quiet decision in his heart. He would no longer be the man who studied faith from a distance. He would walk into it with reverence, It was a small masjid tucked between a bookstore and a florist, quiet, unnoticed by most of the city. Inside, a small group of brothers stood in rows for Maghrib prayer. No fanfare, no media, just the sound of Quranic recitation weaving through the air like a calm breeze. Dr. Jonathan Reed sat near the back watching, listening. His mind, once cluttered with footnotes and arguments, was now still. For months he had moved silently through the edges of the Muslim community, not yet ready to step in fully, but too transformed to walk away. Tonight was different. After the prayer, the imam smiled warmly and gestured for Jonathan to come forward. A few congregants turned surprised. Some recognized him, his story had quietly spread. Most didn't, but all saw the emotion on his face. He stood beside the imam, heart thudding like a drum. The moment felt surreal. Decades of intellectual conquest, long nights of reading, years of skepticism, all had led to this still, humble instant. The imam leaned in gently. "You can repeat after me when you're ready." Jonathan nodded. "Ashhadu Allah ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah." His voice cracked, but the words came clear. "I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah." Tears welled up in his eyes, not from confusion, not from pressure, but from release. The brothers around him quietly said Allahu Akbar, some embracing him, others just smiling. One whispered in his ear, "Welcome home." Jonathan stood silent, heart-racing, eyes flooded. He had crossed an invisible threshold, not into tradition, but into truth. Not into ritual, but into remembrance. Not into a religion he once sought to destroy, but into the faith that had unknowingly rebuilt him from within. Weeks passed. His conversion went mostly unnoticed in the media. A few colleagues called him a sellout. Some ridiculed him publicly. He didn't respond. His days were now filled with prayer, study, and peace. A peace no academic recognition had ever brought. He declined interviews. But he did write one final article. It wasn't published in a journal, but on a humble blog titled simply, "The Historian Who Was Defeated by History." He wrote, "I approached the Prophet Muhammad as a critic. I found a man who forgave when others attacked, who walked away from power when it was offered, who stood for truth when it cost him everything. I didn't find contradiction, I found conviction. I didn't discover myth, I rediscovered meaning." At the end of the post, he quoted a verse that had first rattled his defenses and now stood engraved in his soul. "Say the truth is from your Lord, so whoever wills, let him believe." Quran 18:29. Years later, students still spoke about the man who once set out to disprove a prophet and ended up following him. But Jonathan didn't care about the legacy. He cared about the prayer rug he now carried in his bag, the Quran beside his bed, the peace in his chest that no argument could shake. And every time he whispered the name Muhammad, it wasn't with skepticism, it was with love. Because in seeking to write history, he had found eternity. He was one of the world's top neuroscientists, celebrated, feared, and proudly atheist. Until the day he was arrested. Disgraced and thrown into solitary confinement, he was left with nothing but silence and a Quran. He opened it to mock it, but what he found inside shattered everything he believed about the mind, the soul, and God. What could possibly make a man of science fall to his knees and whisper the Shahada in the dark? And why did he say, "I found the truth, not in a lab, but in a prison cell"? If you're ready to witness a transformation no one saw coming, press 1 to begin. The fall of Dr. Elias Mercer was nothing short of spectacular. Once hailed as the brightest mind in European neuroscience, his face had graced magazine covers. His TED Talks went viral, and his theories were taught in elite universities. But all of it collapsed in a single week. A whistleblower, a fraud investigation, fabricated data, ethical violations, and then the handcuffs, the courtroom, the silence of disgrace. He didn't fight it. He didn't flinch. When asked by a journalist outside the courtroom whether he believed in God now that he'd lost everything, Elias scoffed, "I've studied the human brain for 40 years. I know better." Now he sat alone in a concrete cell. No screens, no books, no applause. Just 4 blank walls and a steel bed bolted to the floor. It was the first time in decades that the noise of admiration had gone silent, and the quiet was unbearable. One morning, a guard paused outside his cell. A quiet man with a trimmed beard and warm eyes. He slid a worn book through the slit in the door. "In case you want something to read," he said simply. Elias looked down. "The Quran," he snorted. "Fairy tales," he muttered, tossing it aside onto the metal shelf. But boredom is a cruel teacher, and pride, when isolated long enough, starts to itch. That night, with nothing else to do, Elias picked up the Quran and opened it. Elias opened the book with the same skepticism he carried into every interview that dared bring up faith. His fingertips brushed over the Arabic script, unfamiliar and ornate, and his eyes settled on the English translation beside it. "This is the book about which there is no doubt a guidance for those conscious of God," he smirked. "No doubt," he muttered. "We'll see about that." He flipped pages without structure, skimming passages, randomly looking for contradictions, fables, pseudoscience. But the pages didn't speak like ancient mythology. They spoke with weight. The tone wasn't poetic fantasy, it was aware, direct. As if the voice behind the words wasn't trying to entertain or comfort, but wake you up. A verse caught him off guard. "Do they not reflect within themselves, God did not create the heavens and the earth and everything between them, except in truth and for an appointed term?" Quran 38. He paused. Something about that line struck a nerve. It wasn't commanding belief, it was commanding thought. He kept reading. "Another verse indeed, in the creation of the heavens and the earth and the alternation of night and day are signs for those of understanding." Quran 3:190. Elias leaned back, arms folded, eyes narrowing. These weren't emotional appeals. They were rational provocations, almost like academic challenges. As if the author was speaking to someone like him, skeptical, analytical, proud. He turned back to the first chapter. "The most merciful, the especially merciful, master of the day of judgment." Elias frowned. Merciful? Where was the fire and brimstone? The emotional manipulation? He kept reading. Days passed. At night, when the guards dimmed the hallway lights, he would sit on his steel bed hunched over the Quran. The lines began to echo in his mind even after he closed the book. He found himself whispering verses aloud just to hear how they sounded. "God is the light of the heavens and the earth." One verse in particular haunted him. "They have hearts with which they do not understand, eyes with which they do not see, and ears with which they do not hear. They are like cattle, no, they are even more astray." Quran 7:179. He clenched the book shut. What does that mean? But he knew what it meant. It described him, a man who could describe every fold of the cerebral cortex, yet had never truly questioned the existence of something greater. A man who had eyes for data, but was blind to meaning. The next day, when the Muslim guard passed by again, Elias asked through the door, "Why did you give me this book?" The guard smiled. "You seem too smart to stay asleep forever." Elias didn't reply. He just stared down at the Quran in his lap, the verse still glowing in his mind. He had opened the book to critique it, but now it was opening him. Elias had once stood in grand lecture halls explaining how every human emotion could be traced to neural circuits, synaptic activity, and predictable biochemical reactions. He was admired not for what he believed, but for what he dismantled. Religion to him was a relic, a comforting illusion for those too weak to face life's randomness. But now, in the stillness of a prison cell, the man of science found himself debating a book that would not debate back. He began keeping a notebook scribbled with challenges, questions, and footnotes. He cross-referenced verses with neurological findings, searching for flaws. But the Quran didn't flinch. It didn't beg to be believed. It simply was. Unapologetic, exact, and oddly aware. "And we created man from an extract of clay. Then we made him a drop in a firm lodging. Then we made the drop into a clinging clot." Quran 23:12-14. Elias frowned as he read the verse again. Embryology described in correct sequence. He flipped through textbooks in the prison library. He compared translations. He told himself it was coincidence, poetry, metaphor. But the language was too specific. Another verse, "He knows what is within the souls." He scoffed at first, but couldn't ignore it. How does this book describe not just biology, but behavior? Pride, denial, anger, envy, all dissected like a spiritual autopsy. He tried to fight back. He jotted counter-arguments. He reminded himself of evolutionary psychology. He reread old articles and even visualized brain scans, trying to drown the verses in data. But the more he read, the more the Quran felt alive. not changing but revealing, responding to thoughts he hadn't spoken aloud. One night Elias threw the book across the room. "Enough," he shouted. "You're just paper and ink." But the echo in the cell mocked him, because deep down he realized something unnerving. This book wasn't reacting to him. He was reacting to it. He retrieved it the next morning, carefully brushing dust from its cover. He opened again to a verse he hadn't yet read. "We will show them our signs in the horizons and within themselves, until it becomes clear to them that this is the truth. Is it not enough that your Lord is a witness over all things?" Quran 41:53. He froze. That verse wasn't about religion. It was about him. He slammed the Quran shut. The room felt small again. The walls closer. His heart pounded. He realized for the first time in his life he had spent years studying the brain to avoid studying his soul. The next time the guard came by, Elias didn't ask for more paper or books. He asked quietly, "What does it mean to pray?" The guard looked at him carefully and replied, "It means to turn to something greater than yourself." Elias stared down at his trembling hands. He wasn't ready to pray, but something inside him had begun to kneel. The silence of Elias's prison cell was no longer empty, it was layered. Every breath he took now echoed with questions he once dismissed. Every time he opened the Quran, it felt less like reading a book and more like being read by one. And then came the verse that shattered him. "Corruption has appeared on land and sea because of what people's hands have earned. So he may let them taste a part of what they have done, that perhaps they will return." Quran 30:41. He sat for hours with that line. It wasn't just relevant, it was surgical. A man who had once falsified research for prestige. A man who lied to journals, deceived students, and wore titles like armor. A man who had built a reputation on intellect but ignored integrity. That verse wasn't accusing him, it was inviting him back. That night Elias didn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, haunted not by his crimes, but by the truth he had fled for years. The Quran didn't speak to him like an accuser. It spoke like a mirror, relentlessly honest but never cruel. Memories returned: his mother praying silently before bed, hands cupped, eyes closed. He used to roll his eyes. His wife too, how she once whispered, "Don't let the world blind you to your soul," before leaving him. He had walked through life surrounded by signs and missed every single one. His pride once, his fortress, now felt like a coffin. And so for the first time in decades, Dr. Elias Mercer did something that had nothing to do with science. No data, no logic, no lecture. He cried. Not from fear, but from awakening. He got out of bed slowly, knees weak, and lowered himself to the cold floor, hands on the ground, forehead against the concrete. He didn't know the words. He didn't know the form. But something inside him bowed fully, humbly, sincerely. "If you are there," he whispered, his voice shaking, "if you are real, I don't want proof. I want peace. Show me what I couldn't see." And for the first time, the silence felt soft, like someone was listening. The next morning, he asked the guard, "Is there a way to learn how Muslims pray?" The guard smiled, not with triumph, but with tenderness. "There is," he said, handing Elias a sheet with simple Arabic phrases and movements. "Start with this. It's not about being perfect, it's about being real." Elias studied it for hours, repeating each word, mimicking each position. And when he placed his forehead to the floor again, now in sujud, a calmness spread through him like medicine finally reaching the illness. He wasn't trying to win anymore. He was trying to return. As the days passed, he found himself waking up just before dawn, not out of routine but longing. He'd whisper in English what he hadn't yet memorized in Arabic. And each time he stood bowed and prostrated, it felt less foreign and more familiar. The man who once believed the mind ruled everything was now listening with his heart. And for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a scientist trapped in failure. He felt like a human being, learning how to be whole again. The cell hadn't changed. The walls were still cracked, the cot still stiff, the food still bland. But something had shifted within. Dr. Elias Mercer, once an academic lion who devoured debates and mocked anything spiritual, now sat cross-legged on the cold floor, Quran open on his lap, eyes wide, not with analysis, but with awe. There was no lightning strike, no angelic visitation. Just verse after verse, gently crumbling the monument of pride he had spent a lifetime building. Indeed, those who dispute about God after he has been acknowledged, there is no proof for them with their Lord. Great is hatred in the sight of Allah that they say what is not true. Quran 40:30. That verse pierced through his chest. Elias remembered the hundreds of times he dismissed believers as unintelligent, weak, desperate. He recalled conference rooms where he proudly declared religion was a neurological delusion, a crutch for the evolutionarily unfit. He now felt shame not because he had been wrong in theory, but because he had been arrogant in spirit. That night he finally said it out loud, no cameras, no witnesses, no fanfare. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. It felt like the cracking of a dam inside him, a quiet surrender, a soft earthquake, a soul uncurling from the tight fist of ego. Tears spilled freely, but for the first time they weren't from guilt or grief. They were from release, as if the weight of decades, the performance, the pride, the pursuit of applause had been lifted, and all that remained was a man and his Lord. The next day, the Muslim guard noticed something different. Elias didn't just nod in greeting, he smiled, genuinely. "You look peaceful," the guard said. Elias exhaled. "I think I've stopped running." He asked for a small prayer rug, then a beginner's guide to Arabic, then a book on the life of the Prophet Muhammad. He consumed every page not as a scholar dissecting a text, but as a thirsty man drinking rainwater for the first time. Each time he recited Surah Al-Fatiha, he did so slower, clearer, until it became more than recitation, it became communion. "Guide us to the straight path" had never felt more personal. As word of his transformation spread through the prison, some inmates mocked him, others grew curious. A few joined him in the courtyard during prayer time, forming quiet rows on dusty concrete. Elias never led. He didn't feel worthy, but he answered questions. He listened. He offered what little he had learned. One day, a former drug dealer asked him, "How does a man like you, a professor, end up believing in something you can't see?" Elias smiled gently. "I believed for years in neurons I couldn't touch in consciousness. I couldn't measure in theories I couldn't prove. But I never asked where the soul fits in." He paused, then added, "Now I know. It fits in prostration." That night he wrote in his prison journal, "My hands once held a scalpel dissecting the brain to find the human code. But it was never in the tissue. It was always in the truth. And I found it not in the lab, but on the floor of a cell." The neuroscientist hadn't lost his mind. He had finally found his heart. Months passed. The man who once dissected minds now sat quietly in sujood, whispering praise to the one who made the heart beat without wires. Dr. Elias Mercer was no longer the subject of breaking news or angry headlines. The media had moved on, but something far greater had begun within him, a life not built on applause, but on submission. The guards noticed the change first. Elias no longer raged when his privileges were revoked. He greeted them with peace even when ignored. He fasted voluntarily on Mondays and Thursdays. He spent hours writing not research papers or rebuttals, but reflections, prayers, and letters to his estranged family. One morning a letter came. It was from his daughter whom he hadn't spoken to in over 2 years. "I saw the clip someone posted, the one where you were praying in the courtyard. I didn't recognize you at first, but your eyes, they looked lighter, softer. You've changed, Dad. I want to know why." He wept holding that letter. Not because of the past, but because hope had begun to grow in soil he once believed was dead. That same week, the prison chaplain, a soft-spoken Moroccan imam, paid him a visit. "I heard you've been leading prayers unofficially," the imam said with a smile. Elias raised his hands. "Only helping. I still make mistakes." The imam placed a hand on his shoulder. "Even the prophet began in a cave with nothing but truth. Mistakes do not disqualify sincerity." The next Friday, with the imam's permission, Elias stood at the front of a small group of inmates. He hesitated before speaking, nervous for the first time in years. Not about being wrong, but about honoring the truth properly. He opened with a verse, "And whoever is blind in this life will be blind in the hereafter." Quran 17:72. Then in a trembling voice he shared his story, not with drama, but with depth. He told them how he used to believe the brain explained everything until he found something it never could piece. "I knew how memories are formed," he said, "but I didn't know how to heal one. I knew how the mind processes pain, but I didn't know how the soul forgives. After the prayer, an older inmate approached him. "You ever think of becoming a teacher again?" he asked. Elias smiled faintly. "Only if it means teaching people how to think beyond the self." Outside the prison, the media picked up rumors of his transformation. Some mocked it. Headlines read, "Disgraced neuroscientist becomes religious," dripping with sarcasm. But Elias didn't respond. He didn't need to. His response came each night when he faced the Qibla in the stillness of his cell and whispered, "Ya Allah, thank you for breaking me. I was too proud to kneel until you gave me no place to stand." He was no longer trying to explain the soul, he was feeding it. And the boy who once read brains to find answers had finally let revelation speak louder than reason. The day Dr. Elias Mercer stepped out of prison, there were no cameras, no reporters, no applause. Just gray skies, a quiet wind, and the soft weight of a Quran in his right hand, creased, weathered, and memorized in parts. He didn't return to a university or lab. He returned to silence, but this time he didn't fear it. In the weeks that followed, Elias moved into a modest apartment above a small masjid on the city's outskirts. He spent his mornings sweeping its floors and his evenings attending classes on Arabic and fiqh, often sitting cross-legged among men half his age. No one called him doctor anymore. They called him Brother Elias, and he liked that better. But the world hadn't forgotten him. An old colleague emailed one day with disbelief. "Are you seriously Muslim now?" Elias replied with a smile. "No, I'm seriously free now." What shook people wasn't just that he had converted, it was that he never tried to defend it. He didn't write rebuttals. He didn't argue online. He simply lived differently, quieter, kinder, fuller. Eventually, he agreed to give a small TEDx talk, not as a neuroscientist, but as a man who had once believed that intellect alone was the highest truth. He stood on stage with no slideshow, no lab coat, no pride. "My name is Elias," he began, "and I spent 40 years mapping the brain. I thought I had figured out everything, how we think, why we feel, what makes us who we are. But I was blind." A hush settled over the audience. "I believed the soul was a myth until I met mine in a prison cell. Not through science, but through silence. Not through study, but through surrender." He paused, then looked out at the room. "You don't have to lose everything to find truth. But sometime it's the only way we listen." The talk went viral, not because it was sensational, but because it was sincere. Across the globe, comments poured in. I watched this and cried. "I'm an atheist, but now I'm curious. I'm a convert too." "You're not alone, brother. Subhanallah." Proof that hearts can awaken at any time. Months later, Elias visited a university where he once lectured. He wasn't invited to debate. He was invited to lead a quiet session on spiritual psychology. Students expected charts. He gave them stories. One asked, "Do you ever miss your old life?" He thought for a moment, then replied, "No, because I've finally met the one who created it. In a world that had taught him to worship the brain, he had finally found the one who made it." He never returned to fame. He didn't need to. His greatest discovery wasn't found under a microscope, but while kneeling on a cold concrete floor, whispering words that didn't make sense to the world, but finally made sense to his heart. And as he would later write in his final journal entry, "For years I searched for the mind's deepest secret. I found it in a verse that said, 'Indeed, in the remembrance of Allah, do hearts find rest.'"